in the hoop design is this beautiful cutlery holder. This design stitches completely in the hoop. It's got a flap and a little tie so that your silverware is held completely secure. Makes it perfect for camping, picnics, symphony on the green, the office, any place that you need to be able to take some utensils with you. A quick untie and unwrap, and your silverware is ready to go. You can even turn it over and have a little placemat on the back. The design package includes this plate and silverware design that can be stitched on the back, or you can leave the back plain. The design is available as a 10x7 or a 5x7 design. The 5x7 design is better suited for plastic ware. Silverware is usually a little large for this, but it does tie up and allow you to take your utensils with you. The design has a number of stitching options in the package. The package actually also includes a mug rug design that's available as a 5x7 or 10x7. And the cutlery that you stitch on the design can be stitched as a solid or as an outline pattern. So you could stitch the flap or the background with either solid or outline, so you can mix and match those elements as desired. You can also do mixing and matching with your colors, whether you do it in one color or two colors. You can stitch a complementary color on the edge, or you can do a contrasting color along the edges of the elements. So there's a lot of ways you can change up this design. It does take a couple of hoopings to stitch this design. If you're going to stitch the plate and silverware on the back of the design, you would do that as the first hooping. So you would stitch those elements on the back fabric. If you don't want to stitch those, then you would go and you would start with the pocket and the flap, or just the pocket on the 5x7 design. So for the back or for these elements, you hoop your stabilizer, you stitch these elements, or you move them from the hoop, remove the stabilizer from the elements. And then the final hooping, or the last hooping, is where you would stitch the front section and then assemble and attach the pocket, the flap, and the back, as well as your little tie straps. So that's all done in the final hooping. So the first thing you want to do when you get this design is to actually print out your overview. The overview of files lists all of the files and what you need for the various designs. So if you want to make the 5x7, if the back, you add the back, you do that. Then choose for the pocket between the outline or the solid fill, etc., etc. So this will help you sort which files you want to use. I also like to print out my layout guides or thread guides. This shows you, this is for the back of the 10x7 design. And it shows you each run, and I've added some little notes because sometimes it's hard to tell from this picture what's going on in that run. So I tell you we're replacing fabric, stitching fabric, etc., so that you'll have an idea what to do. And this can also help you when you're going through the instructions as to what's being done in each step. You, of course, also will want to print out your instructions. That'll go over the files. It'll give you your materials, some tips, and then a detail of what to do in each step while you're embroidering the designs. For materials, I've got 3 pieces of 5x8 fabric. One is for the pocket section, and I've got 2 for the flap. Now for the flap, you do have a couple of options here. You can, if you have fabric that, such as this batik, where the back looks the same as the front, you can just stitch it like that and you don't have to worry about anything, but you will get the elements showing on the inside of the flap there. Don't know that that's a real issue. If your fabric has a front and a back to it, though, when you open it, you'll see the back side of the fabric. We can fix that by using 2 pieces of fabric for the flap. So I'm actually going to show you how in this design we'll use these 2 pieces of fabric so that our back is completely covered when we open that up. So you can stitch it any of those ways. It's a little quicker if you omit the back section, or you can add the back section and make it cleaner. And you could, of course, even omit the words, change the wording, omit the silverware even if you wanted to stitch a super quick design. So I have 2 pieces of 5x8 for my flap section. I have a 12x8 piece for the front. I've got a second piece for the back, and I've cut that one slightly larger since I'm going to be stitching the plate and the silverware on the back. It gives you a little more working room if you make it a little larger. Also, if your fabric has a pattern or a design on it, you may wish to cut the fabric a little bit larger. That gives you a little more room for centering of the design. And if your pattern is directional, make sure that you've got the pattern going the direction you want before you cut your fabric so that it's going to look right on the finished product. So we have all of our fabric. I've also got a piece of ribbon that I've already folded in half. That's going to be our tie string on our finished product. I've got my little scissors here. These have a little curve on them. They make it real nice for getting close to the fabric so I can trim the applique edges. I have my 505 spray. This is a temporary adhesive. I do not like to spray this near my sewing machine, so I usually spray this outside of the room, but I'll spray this on the back of each piece before I put it on the stabilizer or on the products to assemble them. I've also got a piece of white fabric. Oops, I forgot to mention that. For the plate, this is a 7x8 piece of fabric for the plate. If you find that your white fabric is a little thin, you can, and your background is showing through, you can take a piece of stabilizer and fuse that to the back of your white fabric, and that will help prevent the background fabric from bleeding through. Also, if your fabric is particularly a thin fabric, you may want to consider an additional layer of stabilizer for the 10x7 design. That has a little higher stitch count. Most of the stitch counts are 25,000 stitches, so you may want to consider an extra layer of stabilizer for those designs. I have cut 3 pieces of wash away stabilizer. I've already got one of those in my hoop. You want to use the fabric kind, not the plastic topping. I've also, on my large hoop, I like to put a little piece of tape on the one side of the hoop. That helps me keep the correct orientation when I'm taking it in and out of the machine for placing fabric or cutting. And I also like to put a piece of tape along the long edges of this hoop to help keep the stabilizer secure and from slipping. So we've got all of our fabric. I've already ironed all of my fabric. You of course want to press everything before you start. We've got that. I think we're ready to go over to our machine and get started. Now, one thing you've noticed, I've got a lot of stabilizer hanging out of the edges here. That's so that when I cut away the waist pieces are big enough to use in my 4x4 hoop. I'm just going to put my hoop in the machine. And before I start stitching, I always like to go into the edit mode. If you have a single needle, this isn't an issue, but with your multi-needle ladies, you want to go in here, pick the colors you'll be using, and put in appropriate stops. That's what the little hand symbol does, is it puts a stop so that I can place fabric or trim fabric as needed. One of the other tips that I use is for I'm going to stitch white here, but I actually mark it as black or a dark color. If I have white selected, I can't see it. If I use black, then I can see it a little easier on my machine so I know which run is coming up. So I've got that all set. I'm ready to start sewing. The first run is just going to be a placement run to show me where to put that first piece of fabric. The first run has finished stitching. So I have my placement line here. So I'm going to bring this over and I'm going to place my fabric over top of this. I've already put some 505 on the back to keep it secure while stitching, and I'm just going to center that. And this one's kind of large enough, it should be good. And don't necessarily need to iron it, but it helps to just put a little pressure there to keep that nice and smooth. And if you look here, you can see the bobbin thread, so I can use that to kind of hold it up and make sure I've got enough fabric around the edges. So we'll just put this in our machine and we can go ahead and stitch a run that will secure this in place. Okay, the background fabric is stitched in place, and we've stitched a placement run for our plate fabric. I've put a little 505 on the back of that fabric, and I'm just going to set that right over top of that. Make sure I've got enough space there. Lift up this edge and corner so I'm good around there. And we'll just make sure that's pressed down nice and tight. We'll pop this back in our machine. Make sure you keep your orientation. And it's going to stitch the plate in place, and then after that stitch is in place, we'll trim those edges. The plate and silver or napkin section has been stitched in place. I need to trim around the edges, outside edges of the stitching. So I'm going to use my little applique scissors here, and I'm just going to lift gently and just trim right along the edges of those stitched lines. Make sure you get the points on those corners there, and we'll just cut up the inside here. And these little scissors are great for getting right up in there. And we'll just do around the edge of the plate. Edge. And we're just going to make sure we cut off that little point up there so he's not sticking out. So we're going to put our hoop back in the machine. It's going to stitch the satin edges around the silver or the napkin and the plate and the silverware. And then I've got one last stop because I want to delete the last run or skip that. So we'll let this get stitched and we'll come back when it's done. The back is all done stitching. Actually, there's really one more run. It's a little bit of a stippling or quilting that goes around the edge of the plate and silverware, but I think that's going to detract from the pattern of this fabric, so I'm going to skip that run. So we can bring our hoop over. We can take the fabric out of the hoop. Oops, and get the tape off the edges here. We're going to take the design out of the hoop. We're going to trim away some of the excess stabilizer so it'll be a little easier to manage. And as I said, since I cut that a little bit long, that's actually big enough now that I can use that on my 4x4 hoop for a freestanding lace project. And I'll cut that there. And I'm going to do one more. I'm going to go ahead and then take this to the sink so that we can rinse the stabilizer off the back of the fabric. I'm just going to run some cool water. I like to keep a little cup to put the stabilizer in. I don't like that going down my drain. But we're just simply going to wet and pull this right off. And as I said, I'll put that in this cup as opposed to down the drain. And then we're going to go on the inside and get this off of that section as well. And we'll put all of that in this cup. And then we're going to give it a little bit of a rinse just to make sure we've gotten it all off. We want this reasonably soft and smooth. That stabilizer has some starch in it, and we want this to be able to roll up nicely for our cutlery holder, so we're going to get rid of all of that. This is a little wet, so I'm going to take a towel and I'm going to lay it on the towel and simply roll up my towel. And you don't want to twist it too hard because you don't want to put crinkles in it, but you just want to give it a little bit of a gentle twist here, and that will help get that excess water out of this. And we can go give this a quick pressing, and we'll be ready to proceed. While you're pressing, you might want to give a little bit of a pull on the side of the fabric. That will help make sure that it presses flat, help to counteract the stitching and any wrinkles that that might give. I'm all done pressing the design, and I'm going to do one more thing to finish up here. I want to take this white line out that was used to secure the design to the stabilizer. That can sometimes, even if you stretch it nice when you're pressing, it can end up coming in a little bit and showing underneath on the back of your, when you go to add the back. So to prevent you having to deal with that there, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to mark the corners with a pen, and that's going to make it easier for me to place this design when I go to put it on the back. Have my corners all nicely marked already, and won't be having to guesstimate where they are. And then I'm going to take and make a couple of trims and get rid of this thread that's there on the back. So I'm just going to cut that knot there. And probably better to use my seam ripper and cut some of those threads. Okay, I've got my back all cleaned up and set aside, ready to go. Now you could of course also have marked those edges with an erase away or wash away pen, whatever's handy for you. My erasable pen is purple though, so it doesn't show up nice on the purple fabric. I've got my 3 pieces of 5x8 fabric ready. I did change my color choices a little bit here. I've got my piece of stabilizer and the hoop ready to go. And now one comment, you could have actually done the cleanup work on this back after you started the second piece. Anyways, let's get our second piece started. We're going to put the hoop in the machine. As I said, our stabilizer's already in it. I've called up the pattern, I've added my stops and set the colors I want to use. So we're going to start stitching the first run. And I think I forgot to click the thread thing there. So we're going to go ahead and stitch that first one to show where to place that fabric. The placement run has stitched, so I'm going to remove my hoop from the machine. I'm going to come over here. I've already sprayed my fabric with some 505. I'm going to lay that over top of those placement runs. One for the pocket and one for the flap. I'm using the same fabric for both elements. And I will turn that over just to check my placement. Actually, this one needs to go this way a little bit. Oops, that's too much, I think. And this one needs to go this way a hair. So you can also, of course, always just pick up the fabric on the corners and look that you've got enough fabric under each corner. So I'm just going to pick it up like that, and you can see where the stitch lines are and make sure you've got enough fabric over those edges to trim as needed. So we'll just do that, make sure the fabric's nice and smooth there. We're going to return this to the machine. It's going to secure these in places, then stitch the silverware and the Bon Appetit. Then we're going to pause it to trim and add the back fabric for the top flap. The silverware has been stitched, Bon Appetit has been stitched. We are ready to trim the edges of the fabric and to put the lining side of the flap in place. When we trim the fabric, we are going to trim these edges which get the satin stitch applied. So it'll be around the sides and bottom of the flap and across the top of the pocket section. We do not want to trim these other areas. Those will get covered in the final design. So I'm going to take the hoop from the machine. I'm going to trim, as I said, just this top section of the pocket. And we're going to trim the sides, bottom, and the other side. And actually we're going to get just a little bit of the, around the corner here of this top piece. So I'm going to cut right about there. And then we will just go around, and oops, wait, I prefer to cut this way. We'll cut over here. again, cut about there, and then we're just going to cut around this edge here. And then this is, like I said, the edges that will get the satin stitch applied in this stitching run. The other edges will get stitched into the design when it's just during the final assembly of the next run. So I've trimmed around the sides, bottom, and those top corners on the flap and across the top edge of this. The next thing I'm going to do before I put it back is, and if there's any threads that need trimming here, go ahead and trim them now, especially these around the edges. I'm going to put this fabric over the top section. So this is going to give me that lining for the fabric, and I'm just going to lift up the corners and make sure that I've got enough space around them. That looks good. That looks good. That looks okay. So I'm going to turn this back over, and I'm just going to press a little bit. You can't press the other way because you'll pop the stabilizer out. Be careful when you're putting this back in the hoop, since you have the fabric on the back. You want to make sure that doesn't get knocked out of place. The next run will secure that fabric, and then we're going to trim that lining section just like we did the front section. That has been stitched in place, the back piece, the lining, so we're going to bring this over here and we're going to trim just like we did for the front of this piece of fabric. We're going to trim around the sides, bottom, and other side, and just a little bit of that top corner. So we need a snip there, and then we'll just go around here, and we're just going to go around that corner, a little bit of a snip, and we'll trim that. Now we're going to put this back in the sewing machine, and it's going to stitch the satin edge across that top around here, and then add the bird napkin to the pocket section. So we'll let this stitch, like I said, the satin stitching in the last text, and then we will be done with this section. And again, you know, if you wanted to skip the runs with the text, add other text, you can of course make those changes, or you can even skip the silverware altogether to make a really quick stitching here. The design is finished stitching, so the pocket and the flap are all done. Thank you, dear. We can go ahead and remove these from the hoop. We're going to rinse these just like we did the back. Oops, get our tape loose there. So we're going to rinse these from the back, and I'm going to remove the stitches from the sides of this. I'm going to leave the stitches down the bottom. I'm just going to take them out of the sides, and I'm going to leave them up there because that line will get covered with satin stitching, so it's just the one that's easy to cover. It's just these sides that can be a little bit of an issue. So we'll remove them, the stitches from them, and we'll rinse this, and we'll be ready to start the final hooping and final step. We are ready to finish the assembly of our cutlery holder. We have our front fabric, which we haven't done anything to yet. We have the back fabric with the plate and silverware added. We have marked the corners on that and removed the lines that were stitched around that, and that's so it'll look better when we place it. We have our flap all stitched and ironed. All of these are of course been ironed, and we also have our pocket section, and I've removed the stitching from the edges of the pocket section. Again, when we go to line it up, that'll keep those from creating any issues. So I've got my last piece of stabilizer in the hoop, edges secured. I've already loaded my design in the machine. Set the stops that I need. The first run is going to show us where to place this front fabric. Our placement line has been stitched. We'll remove the hook from the machine, put the fabric for the front of the design. I've already sprayed some 505 on the back. We'll lay that over the placement lines. A little cockeyed there. Oops. Okay, yes, I've got enough around all of the edges. So we'll do a quick check, a little press just to help it keep it smooth and in place. We're going to put this back in the machine. It's going to stitch a run around the edge to secure this in place. Then it will stitch this silverware, and then we will pause and add the pocket section. So I'll see you back here shortly. Our silverware has been stitched. It's done a little bit of a placement line there. Kind of hard to see the placement line, but that's to show us where the pocket's going to go. So we place our pocket on now. Now I've got a little bit of 505 on my pocket, but you don't want to use an excessive amount of 505 here because you're going to be able to need to stick things in the pocket. So you're going to do a couple of things to place the pocket. One is to match up the handles of the silverware with the silverware that's stitched on the backing section. And the other is to match up this bottom line here. So I'm just going to lift it up on the side and kind of get my line in place on this side. And I'm going to lift it up on over here and get that line in place over there. Make sure my silverware is aligned where I want it. Now, if you left those lines in places on the sides, they're often hard to line up exactly here, and they end up showing after your satin stitch is stitched. So that's why I have removed those placement lines from the side, because the silverware is the real key that you want to line up on. So we've got that in place, that there. What's going to happen next is it's going to stitch the division lines on it, and then we're going to pause again so that we can put the back in place. So we'll put this in the machine and we will stitch that in place and then stitch the division lines. The pocket has been secured to the fabric and the little division lines between the utensils have been stitched. At this point, we're going to trim the edges around the outside of the stitching on the top, and then we're going to turn it over and put our back fabric in place. So I'm just going to cut around these edges here, just like I've done on all the others. If you've got a little bit of that satin stitching there, don't worry if you cut that a little bit. It's going to be covered when you do the outside stitching. I've got the edges all trimmed on the front. I'm going to turn the design over, and I'm going to place my folded piece of ribbon about midway on the napkin section. Give it about an inch, half inch in, just enough it'll be caught and stitched there. And then I'm going to place my back, and I prefer to place it so that the ribbon is going to be at the top of the design, so if you use that as a placemat, the ribbon won't be in your way while you're eating. So I'm going to place it like this. I've got my little pins here to help me line things up. So there's my bottom edge. I'm looking pretty straight there. There's my top edge. That side, got enough room here over here, so I'm just gonna, kind of do that. I can see where my edge is, make sure I've got enough room and it's straight along that napkin. And the same thing there. I'm going to remove these pins so they're not going to get stitched. They were just there for placement anyways. So we've got that. I'm going to turn it over. I'm just going to press, make sure that back stays secure. We don't want it to slip while we're stitching it. We're going to return it to the machine, and it's going to do a run to secure that back in place, and then we will trim those edges. The back is secured. We're going to take our hoop out of the machine. We're going to bring it back over to our work area, and we're going to trim the back side here. Be careful when you trim that you do not cut your ribbon. It's very annoying to restitch that in there if you've cut it. So we're just going to take and trim right along those edges. Make sure I do not cut my ribbon there. I have done that before, and again, it's no fun when you do it. And we'll just trim around this edge real quick. And then we're going to put this back in the machine. And when we put it back in the machine, it's going to stitch satin stitches around the sides and the bottom edge. And then we will add our flap and stitch the satin stitching around the top edge. If you put the flap on now, it's too hard to keep it from getting stitched down on the sides. So we will finish trimming that there. We'll put this back in the machine. Oops. Make sure we've got our orientation correct. And we'll slide that back in there. And I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to put a piece of tape on this ribbon just to make sure that he doesn't get caught as it's stitching around and pulled anywhere. I've had it get caught when it's doing the satin stitch edge. So we're going to do a satin stitch edge around the sides and bottom, and then we'll stop and add the top flap in. The edges and bottom have been gotten a satin stitch and secured together. What we need to do now is to place our top flap along this edge, and so we want to line up this stitched edge over top of that. Make sure that they're lined up. And lined up. And then we also want to make sure that our silverware is lined up. Make sure everything's still in good alignment. We're good there. And we look to be pretty good there. Silverware is in place, and now it's going to do a little line to secure that in place. Then we will give that a quick trim, and then it will stitch that top edge, or close that top edge with a satin stitch, and we'll be all done. Our top edge has been secured, so I just need to trim that real quick. Some of that stitching you see there is the old or original stitch lines. That's okay if you're cutting those off. This corner just trimmed a little bit better. Make sure he's trimmed good. Now we'll put that back on or in, and it's going to stitch satin across that very top edge, and then we'll just rinse away the stabilizer, and our cutlery holder will be done. Thank you, dear. Our design has finished stitching. We can remove our tape from the sides and remove our design from the hoop. I'm going to trim the stabilizer from the top and bottom. Watch out for your ribbons. And again, because I cut this a little extra long, I've got enough stabilizer there actually to, like I said, fit in my 4x4 hoop for a project. So I'm going to take this in the other room, and what I'm going to do is I just really need to wet these edges, so I'm going to fill the sink with some cold water here, and I'm going to dip each edge just right up to the satin stitching, and I'll dip all 4 edges, and then I'll just pull that stabilizer away like I did before, and I'll put it in my waste cup here. We'll let it get just a little more water in the sink. I'll keep my ribbons out of the way here. I think we're about good there. So I'm just going to dip or turn, and like I said, I'm dipping right up to where that satin stitching starts and turn, and then we can, whoops, just pull this away and drop it in that cup, and we're all set. If there's any stabilizer remaining on the edge, just dip your finger in the water and you can just run it along that edge there to get rid of it. So we can take this in the other room and give it a quick press, and we'll be all set. So I'm just going to give this a quick final pressing. And we'll turn it over and just give the back a quick pressing. Now, you know, I forgot to change my bobbin thread, but you may want to consider using bobbin thread that matches your top thread to give you a little more finished look on the back. This still looks nice, I think, but and it kind of works with the fabric. It picks up some of the white in it, so I can get away with it. But you may want to think about your bobbin thread when you do those final satin runs. And I do have some comments on that in the instructions. Okay, we are all pressed here. So, our cutlery holder is complete, ready to fill with utensils. Just lift the flap and stick in your... Oops, I've got my knife going the wrong way. Got to match them up properly. Fork, tuck a napkin in there, and roll it up. Give it a tie, and your cutlery holder is ready for travel. When you get to lunch, open it up. You can take out your utensils, and you've got a little placemat that you can use to put your lunch or food on. As I said, this design has a number of options. You can add all of the embellishments. You can stitch it plain and just have just the cutlery holder, 5x7 size, mug rugs, lots of options with this design. Our design is all complete, and just want to show you here the difference with the finished lining, or the lined flap versus the unlined flap. So gives you a little more finished look. This one certainly still looks nice or presentable. There's another one with the unlined flap. So here the fabric was the same, but you could see a little bit of the, you can see the stitch design in the back of it. The completely lined flap covers that back and gives you the matching fabric, or the good fabric on both sides. We hope you've enjoyed this design. If so, please like this channel and subscribe to this channel for more in the hoop designs. Happy stitching!